a cavalcade of writers who dazzle with their wit, a mighty throng of seamen, awash with God and grit, the poets and the artists who venerate these shores, the tourists in their flip-flops, track sand into the stores, disciples of St. Peter, who worship by the sea, the wise Sicilian nonnas, reciting rosary, descendants of the English, the Finns and Portuguese, who greet each other daily and coexist in peace, the wealthy in their mansions, along a scenic drive, the minimum wage workers who struggle to survive, and don't forget the first ones, to walk these storied hills. Their whispers linger in the wind, their drumbeats echo still.
Well, hello and welcome today. It's a special program on writing. In fact, I hope to believe it might be titled The Joy of Writing, or Today on the Finnish Writer, as Julia Child used to say for her French cooking show. Something that will show you joy and taking pleasure in writing, whether you've written anything before or not. Because among my guests here, through the years, we've had different writers, but Bob Bozelman, who is on my left here, Bob is the first to say, if I ask the question, are you a person who writes a lot?
No.
You see it's spontaneous and unrehearsed. I really wanted some input from somebody who is not a natural born or habitual writer, because some of you may relate to that and say, well, I never wrote anything, I don't know if I can. Yes, you can. I'm going to encourage you and have a passion to do so. I hope that you will find it interesting from the very beginning. In this way, I turn to my colleague. Believe it or not, there's a New York Times bestseller. This month, her work is in the New Yorker magazine, which is really the best magazine you could possibly be in as a writer in today's America. Laurie Gwen Shapiro. And Laurie Gwen Shapiro has a long and storied career in writing. She's going to have a book out this summer on Amelia Earhart, which is her second, I think, coming bestseller, because she has already had one out called The Stowaway. May I say, if you go to the library and you get The Stowaway, it'll be an exciting adventure, a real true story, very accurately told, wonderfully well written by Laurie Gwen Shapiro. And why I bring her up here today on this idea of, well, even if you haven't written a lot, you can still write, and you write well, it is because Laurie Gwen Shapiro shared with us some time ago a writing that she made when she was in the second grade. Have you saved your stuff from the second grade?
I don't think so.
I doubt it. I didn't. But she did. She has something that I'd like to share with you here. I'm looking at now on the screen. Perhaps you could see it. It's a very short story. It's called The Ghost and the Witch. And as I'm going to read it to you in 1 minute here, once upon a time there lived a ghost who had no friends. But one day he was walking through the forest and he met a witch, and she said, "You're a good-looking ghost." The ghost said, "Hey, let's be buddies." And so on Halloween, they always went trick-or-treating together. And that was Laurie Gwen Shapiro's first published work, when she was in the second grade. The school had a newsletter. Students were selected on the basis of quality for something that they had written, and Laurie Gwen Shapiro's first published work was what I just read, The Ghost and the Witch. Why do I bring it up for people who are interested in writing but not very experienced in writing? I want to point out some things that, Bob, you may have noticed already in this work. From the very beginning, the title is important. Were you intrigued and interested in reading further when you heard me read, or you saw on the screen that the title was The Ghost and the Witch? Any kind of a stir of excitement or interest in it from the title? You got there. It wasn't dull. It was something that you'd meet with some expectation, hope that it would be an interesting story that you'd read and remember. The Ghost and the Witch. Then the first sentence introduces what we call in the trade the protagonist, otherwise known as the hero, somebody in the story whom you root for. And here I'm going to interrupt myself because it's helpful to you to know how core, how exactly in the middle of the treasure this idea is. I was one time in a class of about 30 people with Kurt Vonnegut, and Kurt Vonnegut taught one day for about 3 hours in a house on Newbury Street in Boston. And if you were lucky, you applied to be part of the class. You got in. I got in, luckily, amongst people who were far superior writers than me. But I'm listening to Kurt Vonnegut himself describe this next point. He told us that we always want to have, to present, to give the reader a person to root for. I mean, when we turn on the television and it happens to be the Red Sox game, I think you know, we've got somebody to root for immediately. We have a standing invitation to do that with the Red Sox. But if you aren't tuning in on the TV for a baseball game, you're in a book. From the beginning, you really want somebody to root for. And Kurt Vonnegut is suggesting that he always, from the beginning, in his stories, presents somebody to root for in the story. Usually a bit of an underdog, usually somebody under stress. Hanging from his fingernails at the cliff, John was ready to fall. Well, you're going to root for that guy, hopefully that he won't fall or die. And in this instance, Laurie, from second grade, knew what Kurt Vonnegut was teaching us in his master class of writing. She said, once upon a time there lived a ghost who had no friends. Now, probably in the second grade, maybe the fifth grade, maybe in high school, you would have a feeling, what a terrible fate to be anywhere where you have no friends. So she presented, I think, possibly the worst catastrophe, stress, and problem that you could possibly have in life when she was second grader, that no friends. So she presented that from the beginning. Now that's a person, a ghost, you want to root for, because she presented from the beginning, once upon a time there lived a ghost who had no friends. That gives you a clue in the book that she's writing, in the short story she's writing, in the book that others are writing. You want to have a problem that by the end of the work, whether it's a short story or a novel, a problem which is solved. So if you have somebody being chased by a bear in the woods, by the end of it, you want the bear to be killed or eliminated somehow from chasing after the protagonist. In this instance, you know from the beginning, if Laurie knows what she's doing, which as a writer she did, even at a young age, a child prodigy, that somebody without friends by the end of the story is going to have
A friend.
a friend. That's good. But one day he was walking through the forest, and here again I interrupt because it's a common part of writing that there's a journey, and an actual factual journey in which somebody's walking, driving, flying, whatever, going through some of the, they call it on the road stories. Jack Kerouac's classic, On the Road. Well, you're in a journey. Don Quixote is a journey all through Spain. And these other books that you can, novels you can read, are journeys. Either they're physical and geographical journeys, or they're journeys essentially of the mind and metaphorical journeys. But one day he was walking through the forest, which is a common thing for your writing to be aware of. It's good to have them in motion. And he met a witch. And here we go into dialogue, which every novel you ever read is about 80% dialogue. Quotation marks around what somebody said. The response, the further response, the argument, and various parts of every book are dialogue. In this instance, Laurie in the second grade knows to put dialogue together. So the witch says, "You're a good-looking ghost." Now, as much as it is concise, it's also something that the ghost has to respond to, and you read it because you wonder if he's going to be timid or run away or say something that isn't quite right, or he's going to say something affirmative, and you're hoping, you're rooting for him to say something affirmative, and he does. The ghost said, "Hey, let's be buddies." You could almost end it there, but Laurie is duty-bound to present it in a way that you can picture and see, much as the prince and the princess march off into the sunset. And so on, this is a kid now, and so on Halloween, they always went trick-or-treating together, which is probably the ultimate in dating for a second grader, right? Going out together trick-or-treating. And that's the whole story. So I encourage you to recognize in this the elements of any writing that you might undertake. To start with a problem that by the end of the writing you will solve. And as it unfolds, of course there's dialogue, but you're rooting for a particular protagonist to be successful. And in the course of it, you're essentially going to go from some type of a difficulty or stress or failure or problem to some kind of ultimate success. And that's it in a nutshell. And Laurie knew it when she was in the second grade. So it's nothing that you can, nothing over your head. You can do it too. Let's do, and let me find an example for you that is local. Some of you may know the name Rick Hautala. Rick Hautala was a Rockport genius, really, especially in the writing of horror stories, science fiction and horror stories. And he won awards for his short stories, and he was also, in terms of one of his books, a bestseller. And I'm going to show you that book right now, which is called Nightstone. And again, we're starting with a book, the title of which, question mark, does it draw your attention? Nightstone, knowing you're looking for a horror story. Nightstone, does it draw your attention?
It does.
It does. In this instance, his book Nightstone was one of the first of the holographic covers. You can't tell on the TV screen, but it's actually a raised raised impression. And at the top, there's a picture of a little girl, but if you turn it one way or another, the hologram that was on this, it turns into a skull. So it's either a skull or a little girl. And of course it's scary. I mean, the book itself is written that way. But what I want to look at is how closely does this reflect Laurie Gwen Shapiro's prodigy mind when this sold over 1 million copies internationally. It was translated in other languages. Rick Houtala made $1 million on this book. And it is, it starts out this way. On the back of it here, there's something Stephen King, you may have heard of, said he raves about Rick Houtala's book as one of the best horror novels I've read. It's Stephen King. But anyway, on this one, Nightstone, see how it begins. There's a chapter title, The Winter's Storm. Already you see some kind of distress or trouble with the storm. All right. With evening, the sky turned the color of thick soot. Toivo Kivinen, Rick Houtala was Finnish, and he likes finished names. Toivo Kivinen shouldered open the door of his house, stepped inside, then swung the door firmly shut behind him. He stamped his feet on the braided rug, and most of the snow clinging to his woolen pants fell to the floor. Small puddles began to form and spread. "You look cold," Auni, his wife, said, looking up from her knitting. Now, at the start of it, do you see anybody in any kind of hint of trouble? Toivo? Do you see him?
He's just coming out of the winter.
He's just coming in out of the winter. He must have been out there doing something, probably work, and it's despite the weather and elements, and he comes in, he's cold, he stamps his feet, and his wife says, "You look cold," which is like you have an impression that is not dispelled, it's accurate, that this fella is not in a really, what's the opposite? You would think of it immediately in California. It would be sitting in the sunshine, drinking a margarita at the swimming pool, and right? That kind of thing. Yeah. It's not going around stomping your feet from a cold when it's snow and the skies are darkening in Maine, this is in Maine. So I'm telling you, there's an example here that we can feel is similar to Laurie Gwen Shapiro at second grade. That by golly, Rick Houtala of Rockport, who's a Finn, knows such things as started out with somebody in some degree of trouble where you're thinking, I hope the guy, makes it out okay by the end of the book. We're going to try an example of something. See if I can get this on the screen before you at this point is a free. I mean, if you go to the library, it's free. Probably in the you can get it at a great discount now because it's several years old. In the great courses, there's something called Building Great Sentences, and it comes not only as a video, which you can watch, or CDs, which you can watch, but also with a small handbook that's called Building Great Sentences. And a lot of you who are would-be authors, inexperienced writers, are going to say, what, sentences? Everybody writes sentences. That's nothing. I'm talking about writing a short story. I'm talking about writing a novel. Well, that's true, but what are they made of? They're made of sentences. And in fact, they're made of good sentences. So you can say, well, let's just quote from the book, Building Great Sentences. I love the way he describes. This is just page 56 of his book. And he says, this is about writing that we all do. Anyone who writes, we're in a brotherhood or sisterhood of writing, because he says one of the important purposes that we should always have when we write is, as Joan Didion so powerfully put it in her celebrated essay on keeping a notebook, quote, remember what it was to be me, unquote. When we're writing this, and he says it, if we scale down to the level of the sentences we write, it suggests that we should be concerned not just with the accuracy and the clarity of what we write, but that we should also be concerned with making our writing a reflection of who we are, how we think, and what we value. So, can I emphasize, all writers are not alike, and everybody should be different in their own way when they're writing, because what you value is a little bit different than what I value, and what I know or notice is different from what you know or notice. And what you want to do is get across that in your writing as a preservation of your mindset, which is unique. And it's your voice that you bring to the party, or else you don't get there. So don't just be imitative. Always think of your own views. There's a fellow named Arnold Samuelson, and I don't blame anybody here for not knowing who Arnold Samuelson was. In the 1930s, Arnold Samuelson was a kind of a impoverished. It was the time of the Depression. He was an impoverished man in the wrong end of the country to meet Ernest Hemingway. But he wanted to meet Ernest Hemingway. He was up in Detroit. And he started off on his journey with no money, riding the rails. You know how you could jump aboard a freight train and maybe hide until it went south to Florida, and eventually you got there. He got from Detroit to Florida to meet Ernest Hemingway. Didn't know him, didn't have any recommendations, was obviously in his own clothes, and after 2 or 3 days journey on the rails, nonetheless was in Florida, was in the town with Ernest Hemingway. And he asked, he asked at the grocery store where he couldn't afford a cheese sandwich, but where's Ernest Hemingway's house? And he was told the directions. He understood. So he arrived in about noontime, and he knocked on the door, and Ernest Hemingway opened the door, looked out at him, he said, quote, what do you want? And the guy explained, well, Mr. Hemingway, I'm a great fan of yours, I want to meet you. And Ernest really, he was busy, he was working, he was writing. So he says, come back tomorrow at noon. Close the door. I think the guy, Arnold Samuelson, I think he went to the police, and he says, I don't have a place to stay, I don't have any money. Can I sleep in the jail cell? And they let him. This is a small town, and they didn't have much business, so they let him sleep in the jail cell overnight. And the next, I don't know if they fed him as well, but at the next day, he went to Ernest Hemingway's house as scheduled, expected. And Ernest Hemingway then, rather graciously, had time set aside for him, talked with him, and eventually turned out Ernest was going to soon leave for Cuba in his yacht. And he didn't have everybody arranged to be a crew on his yacht. So he said to the Arnold Samuelson from Detroit, have you ever been on a boat? No. Well, okay, you're hired. He's going to take him on. All he's really going to get is free lessons in writing and food. He wasn't hired for any money. He was going to get a trip to Cuba with Ernest Hemingway and some others in the crew. But the point I'm making here is that Arnold Samuelson, when he got done with this after a year or two, chumming with Ernest Hemingway, and gradually even improving his lot and being a paid helper, wrote his own story or memoir of Ernest Hemingway. And he told about the lessons that he got from Ernest Hemingway. And I'd like to see if we have that next. Yes, Arnold Samuelson exercise. This is from Ernest Hemingway, although Arnold Samuelson is the one that wrote it down and published it. This is from Ernest Hemingway. Study the situation. Describe it from different points of view or emotion. In other words, looking at the same scene in a happy way, looking at the same scene in a sad way, looking at the same scene in different kinds of emotion. To understand what you're looking at, not to judge. And do that over and over. Practice, practice, practice. The source, again, of this is Ernest Hemingway. Any of you who get, you're on a computer, on YouTube, you can search for Hemingway's 3-step writing exercise. And it's on there in the same way I just described from Arnold Samuelson, as Ernest Hemingway told him what to do. I one time took a class from a cartoonist of some note, though he's passed away years ago, a Boston cartoonist named Omar White. And he was in his 70s or 80s when I had him as a teacher on Saturdays for a few Saturdays in cartooning. And Omar White thereafter encouraged us to very much like this. Study whatever's going in this studio, for instance. We would study the chairs and observe whatever we see, and start writing or sketching the chair that we see and the other things, not in full detail, leaving stuff out, doing only a line instead of 15 lines, and nothing busy, and trying to get the abstraction of what we see in this situation, and try to express what we are noting with our eyes as important, and excluding whatever is not part of our vision or story. And I remember a few years after I took the class, running into him accidentally, and he didn't know it. We were both on the same T as it was going from Cambridge to Boston, and it was fairly crowded, so I was at a distance from him, but I had a vision. I could see him seated, and I was standing and watching. And what I saw is he had his notebook out. And what was he doing? He was looking at people, just a little glance. He wasn't staring, because that would be impolite and offensive. He was just taking a quick glance at somebody, and I'm sure he was making their face, their caricature, as according to what he saw, and exaggerating somewhat. He encouraged us always to consider exaggerating, a larger nose or a smaller eyes or whatever the situation is that makes a more interesting picture. So I was observing what Hemingway said for writing. I was observing for art by Omar White. And it was happening in real time. So I'd encourage you to believe that if you walk around with a notebook, and it doesn't have to be a bound notebook, it doesn't have to be a pad of paper, it can be index cards, which you just take one at a time. If you notice somebody overhear somebody's dialogue, some comment or thing that they're saying, I'm glad my baby was born with hair. Well, that's kind of an interesting line, and you overheard it, and you say, maybe in a story that would make an interesting line in a story. So you get your notepad or index card or pad of paper out and write down, I'm glad my baby was born with hair, or whatever the word is in the line that you noticed, or the description that just strikes you, that you want to you're always talking about trees, nature, you never saw such a year for locust trees. And you may in your notebook write down that kind of thing because it'll come in handy when you want to consider what's the right setting for the story that you want to unfold. Now, I'm going to ask Bob for a help right now in demonstrate something for you all. Writing is rewriting. In other words, there's such a thing as a first draft, and many new writers are surprised that there's anything after that. You know, once you've written down your paragraph or your story, you're done with it. You're there. My suggestion is nobody's there. First drafts are usually terrible and in need of work. Don't be offended or troubled that you didn't get there in the first try, because that's true of all of us who write. We eventually learn, sooner or later, if we persist in writing, that first drafts we've got to work on to a second draft and a third draft, a fourth draft. And all I'm going to do is demonstrate here the improvement possible in remembering that sentences are the unit. I'm going to ask Bob for either a fragment or an actual sentence for me to work with. And we'll develop it in the same way that you have a first draft and a second draft and even a third, fourth draft. Give me, this is unrehearsed, spontaneous. Give me a fragment, a sentence, a noun and a verb, or a full sentence, whatever comes to your mind.
Sure, I'll give you a sentence. As I was walking through the forest, I realized how beautiful the trees were.
Okay, I'm going to try to. As I was walking through the forest, I realized how beautiful the trees were. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is your suggestion? Okay. Okay. Now, if I had written that, I would feel happy that I had completed a sentence, and it does evoke kind of something in nature and suggests, I guess, that I, first person, is the hero or the protagonist. And can I add, for those who don't know already, first person is the most powerful point of view that you can use. Third person, he, she, it, is not as powerful as I, because people can instantly directly relate to I and make themselves take on your identity as you're describing it. But anyway, as I was walking through the forest, I realized how beautiful the trees were. Now, I'm working on that, thinking about that, and saying it's very abstract. For the moment, there is no distinction between one forest and another, between Yellowstone and Dogtown Common, between, I suppose, some trees in between the houses in Brookline and the most glorious Amazon forest, the jungle, really, as I was walking through the forest. So I'd want to work on specifying, adding details to the forest, so I could tell the forest from the trees, right? And then how beautiful the trees were. Similarly is not a description of trees at all. It's an adjective that I input. I can see those, what I'm seeing as trees, whatever they are, I judge as beautiful. I'm concerned because I want to unfold that in a more interesting way as a sentence to other people. So far, I haven't let the reader into me, except I saw something beautiful, right? So I like to go into the details. And maybe I will start, although this sentence says, as I was walking, which is the journey, which is the wonderful theme or motif often in what people write. As I was walking is not the key that you're focused on. You're focused on the forest, but it comes many words later. As I was walking through the forest. Well, start with the forest. Even now, I remember, if anybody's familiar with the ecological writer, Diane Dumanowski. Even now, I remember a description she began with one of her essays. Diane Dumanowski, who's also from Massachusetts, I think Lowell, Massachusetts. Diane Dumanowski wrote about the rainforest in Hawaii and a rainbow. It was the start of her essay. And I still, to this day, and it's probably been 20 years since I read it, it glows. It was a wonderful description. I clipped it out and I still have it at home. It's a wonderful thing. But anyway, so you've got to do, I think, I'll work on it. As I was walking through the forest, visualize a forest that you've been in or that you've seen on television. Tell me about a forest and tell me about that forest. Almost close your eyes. Here now, you're immersed in the forest. What do you see? Tell me what that looks like. Without using the word forest, tell me. Help me out.
Yeah, but you could come up with a sentence like the trees were fully grown and characteristic of mighty oaks.
All right. And the only reason I'm not writing that down is because this is the thing writers do. They don't write everything down, but they do think it through. Oaks, I'm going to pick on that. Oaks. What's different about oaks from other trees? I would say that's beautiful, even though other trees might be trying or competing for beauty. But the oak makes it for me. What is it about the oak that crosses the finish line? Think about that and tell me. Because remember, it's your voice and your thoughts and what you value and what you know, not what anybody else does. Whatever they do, they pass by the oak. They might not even see it. But you did. You have. Tell me more about the oak. Working it.
The oaks were big, powerfully built, with strong trunks and boughs.
I like that. In that direction, we're really getting somewhere writing-wise, to have somebody feel what you felt and communicate in a written way. Is this one oak tree?
It's a group of older trees.
Can you single out the largest of all? The largest oak of all was, and then you go through
the largest of all.
The largest
dominated the scene.
The largest oak dominated. Period. I'm going to say the largest oak dominated. That's the way I would do it. The largest oak dominated. Upward of how tall? Upward of how many feet?
70 feet tall.
Upward of 70 feet with roots. Are the roots of an oak above ground?
You can see them at the base of the tree.
With the roots at its base, as thick as what? How do you just? Here you can go two ways. You can go the actual measurements, like as thick as 15 inches, or something that would be descriptive of that size. As
thick as some of the branches in the tree.
Well, that would be referring to the same tree that you're looking at, so it doesn't get the reader anywhere. But as thick as something the reader's familiar with. As thick, baseball bat is too small, but as thick as what's a garden hose simile? It's just small. As thick
as a fire hose.
That seems to me not as thick as I've seen. Seems to me the roots are thicker than that. Thick as an elephant's trunk, but I don't know.
Thick as the tires on your truck.
Thick as the tires on your truck, except that's the wrong shape. Yeah. So try to think this through. What is it that you can? I mean, as thick as the thighs on the fat man in the circus. I mean, I don't know, something that would be captivating as a simile or a metaphor, or we're trying to get something in writing that impresses, gives you the picture better than simply 15 inches or whatever it is. But anyway, you get the picture, what we're doing, we're writing. The largest oak dominated is just one short sentence. The next sentence can be long because you can vary the sentences. I mean, this man is the biggest advocate of varying sentences, the length of the short ones and long ones and in between. The wonderful thing about writing is you have the control to do that and divide your sentences to short and small. The largest oak dominated, upward of 70 feet, with roots at its base as thick as to be announced. The oak was at least how old?
150 years. You can round it off. Just say 100 years. That gets the idea.
At least
100 years. Yeah.
I mean, this is a clue that you've met the standard, which is you want a sentence that will include impact or a surprise to the reader, and I think you can't escape being surprised when you think of a oak tree in its reality being older than any person you know. It's at least 100 years old. And that's a surprise. And if you can do that sentence by sentence, surprise by surprise, it's a wonderful thing to do. The largest oak dominated, upward of 70 feet with roots at its base as thick as whatever we come up with. The oak was at least 100 years old. Now, when we're describing anything, we try to, where it's relevant, we try to tell about our response to it. And you did in the original, the first draft. You realized how beautiful. And I'm asking you to step back and realize that the reader would rather you describe, your internal temperature, pulse rate, heart rate, than say that something was pleasant or beautiful or pleased you or whatever, because you can show them more and they can embrace it. They've been there before. Even in this instance, I think it would be shown by you would stop, you pause. You had been walking, but you stopped and stared. Well, the reader alongside you, stopping and staring, has a sense, I believe, from that alone, that a sense of your emotions, heightened emotions, that you would actually interrupt whatever you're doing to look at this tree. So I'm going to say, you're for the moment, and you could suggest other things if it comes to you. I stopped and stared at the ancient tree. because by now, you've got a chance to refer to it in a shorthand way, abbreviated way. You don't have to carry you don't have to, I stopped and stared at the 100-year-old 70-foot tree. That's already in the reader's mind. So they're going to be pleased if you stopped and stared at the ancient tree. Or listened to the drum beat in the
background.
Anyway, you got any other ideas on this? Can you recognize that you've made progress, you've increased, you've improved what you started with?
You could say something like the roots at the base were, as big as your chest, or something, or as large as an elephant's trunk.
That kind of thing. We're always going for this. All the writers, all of us are going for that. And I don't know for the moment what we just put to be announced. And you don't have to, you always can do as much as you want today and then come back to it tomorrow and think of another way of expressing it. You need something in there. If you're going to please the reader, you're always trying to be reader friendly and to please the reader. I'm going to go on now to another a master of writing, Anton Chekhov. He's a Russian from more than 100 years ago. You may not have necessarily read him, but have you heard of Anton Chekhov? Maybe not.
Not that I can recall.
Okay. As soon as you hear the first paragraph of a short story he wrote called Misery, I think you'll say he's a good writer, and you can learn from him. Let's do that. I'm going to move over to Anton Chekhov. There we are. I'm going to read this aloud. It's just short, but it immediately gets you to thinking, I believe, about what we talked about. A protagonist in some kind of trouble who you've got to root for him. And in this case, I should add, this is a Russia from 150 to 200 years ago. The equivalent of a taxi cab driver in Russia was known as a sledge driver, who in winter would have an actual sledge with runners, and the horse would pull the sledge through the snow. And this was the equivalent of a taxi cab driver, but they called it a sledge driver. And I'm going to, with that much of an annotation, you understand. Misery by Anton Chekhov. To whom shall I tell my grief? You already know somebody suffered a loss of some kind, and he's asking, to whom shall I tell my grief? The twilight of evening. We'll go back to that, but for the moment I'm going to just read through. The twilight of evening. Big flakes of wet snow are whirling lazily about the street lamps, which have just been lighted, and lying in a thin, soft layer of roofs, horses' backs, shoulders, caps. Ayana Patov, the sledge driver, is all white like a ghost. He sits on the box without stirring, bent as double as a living body can be bent. If a regular snowdrift fell on him, it seems as though even then he would not think it necessary to shake it off. His little mare is white and motionless too. Her stillness, the angularity of her lines, and the stick-like straightness of her legs make her look like a halfpenny gingerbread house horse. She is probably lost in thought. Anyone who has been torn away from the plow from the familiar gray landscapes and cast into this slough full of monstrous lights, of unceasing uproar and hurrying people, is bound to think. The title itself is Misery. I don't think it's going to be compelling to most people to say, oh great, a story about misery. And yet, if you want to know what the story's about, and you're attracted to the hope that somehow this misery is resolved in favor of the guy you're rooting for, and you trust Chekhov to bring you there, you might pick up this story. By the way, if you have a computer and you search Misery by Chekhov, full text, you'll be able to find it for free. It's a frequent flyer. A lot of people like to read it, and you can go from there. But I told you I'd be back to it, and I'm looking at this. The very beginning of after he says, to whom shall I tell my grief, is a fragment. It's not a full sentence. The twilight of evening, period. Why I bring that up is you can use fragments. They have a purpose. They often have multi-purposes. But if you use a fragment, it would be a way of, you know how a movie differs from individual photographs? Well, the movie is this short story as it moves along in full sentences. The photograph, standalone, snapshot, is the sentence fragment. And in this instance, see if we can get this back. I don't. Anyhow, the sentence fragment is a way of isolating and stopping without a verb. Static. Without a verb means frozen. And what an ideal when you're having a snowstorm where nobody moves. The guy's bent over and he's covered with snow and he isn't even shaking it off. It's frozen. And each sentence indicates that to you. You think back and say, I wonder why this fellow is saying, to whom shall I speak my grief? And he's not moving, and he's bent over, and he's covered with snow, and he's like a ghost. That was in there in the Chekhov's writing. I'll tell you, it's not a spoiler because it's important to the story, and it's presented rather early, just not this early. He just lost his son. His son has died. And it was his life. His belief was he'd pass on everything he had to his son, whom he loved dearly. His son was gone. So now he's stunned. And he's back, he's at work because he's poor. He's a poor man anyway. He's back at work with this horse. And even the horse, Chekhov allows us to imagine a horse's thoughts. Even the horse is stuck, wondering and pondering and wishing, being back behind a plow in a familiar landscape and in the countryside like a young horse. And instead he's in this busy world with a lot of lights and hurrying people by, and it's not comfortable, it's not nice. And Chekhov wants to bring that in. Well, not every author would. Every writer can dispute whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. We also can dispute whether that quotation, to whom shall I tell my grief, we can also dispute whether that's a good idea. We can say to Chekhov, if I wrote that story, I would start with, it was twilight, or the way he did without the quotation. Because the quotation stands alone, if you notice. He didn't say, the sledge driver thought, to whom can I console my grief. He just said it. Well, he said it because it's a thought in the head that wasn't communicated to anybody, that's going around and around in this man who isn't moving. It's a way of presenting the problem. There's an unspoken thought in his head about who's going to listen to my grief. But at the moment, you're not told who's doing the thinking or why. And intentionally, it's not an error by Chekhov. He's intending to have a puzzle that he will solve eventually. There's so much more we can talk about writing, but we won't, because we want you to write. We want you to start your own short story or novel with a sentence or two in a writer's notebook. And if that will, if whatever we've done here inspires you, maybe you too will write a 1,000,000 copy bestseller like Rick Hautala did when he was starting out. Bob, I wanted to give you a chance to have the last word on your feelings about the writing that you did here, focusing on an oak tree. You have a feeling that you improved your first draft?
It needs work.
But it still needs work.
Yeah, it still needs work.
The beautiful part, I would emphasize to you, writing is rewriting. First draft will not do it. Second draft, don't be satisfied. Go on to a third draft, fourth draft, and the next day you can work on it again. It can be, what do you say, for fun and profit. Writing can be for fun and profit. I hope you'll have a chance to read Misery by Anton Chekhov and be as moved by it as I was, and also to pay attention to how he did it, how he unfolded the story in fragments as well as full sentences, and through what a horse was thinking as well as what the sledge driver was thinking, and the people he encounters along the way. I won't spoil it, but it's a wonderful story. And he told it in about 2,000 words, which is about 10 pages. Thank you. See you next time. And I'm glad you could join us for this writing study. Thank you. Thank you.
Tuolla Lontoossa Jennyn mä kohtasin. Halo väki, oho. Hän on neitosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo väki, oho. Suukon kirsikka silmät niin mustat kuin yö. Ja ne loisti kuin tuikkiva tähtien työ.